June 26, 1944, Hollandia Air Base, Dutch New Guinea. Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald sat across a checkers board, deep in thought over his next move against Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith, operations officer of the Satan's Angels fighter group. The game was interrupted by a knock at the screen door. A man introduced himself quietly, his tone calm but assured. At first, MacDonald barely registered the name, he was too focused on the board. But when the visitor repeated himself, MacDonald froze. Charles Lindbergh, the Charles Lindbergh, America's most famous aviator, stood before him, asking permission to discuss P-38 combat operations. Neither man could have known that this interruption would soon change the nature of long-range air warfare in the Pacific. Over the next 6 weeks, the civilian visitor would teach techniques that extended the Lockheed P-38 Lightning's range by almost 400 miles, transforming what pilots thought impossible into everyday practice. This was not just a story of fuel and flight. It was about overcoming institutional resistance through results, about learning to trust mathematics over instinct, and about how one man's mastery of efficiency reshaped aerial warfare. Lindbergh's journey to that screen door had begun 17 years earlier, far from the Pacific. On May 20th to 21st, 1927, the world watched as Charles Augustus Lindbergh flew the Spirit of St. Louis, a single-engine Ryan monoplane, from New York to Paris, covering 3,600 miles in 33.5 hours. His fuel tanks held 450 gallons, so large they blocked his forward view. He navigated by periscope and dead reckoning, monitoring fuel with a precision few pilots of the time could imagine. When he landed at Le Bourget Field, he still had 85 gallons remaining, proving that extraordinary range could be achieved through exacting control of power and mixture. That obsession with fuel management became Lindbergh's lifelong expertise. During the 1930s, while flying survey routes for Pan American Airways across the Atlantic and Pacific, he refined his understanding of range, discovering that manufacturer specifications were conservative averages, not limits. Every engine had a sweet spot where power, fuel burn, and stress balanced perfectly. Finding it required a deep grasp of manifold pressure, propeller RPM, mixture, and airspeed, a science few mastered. By the time World War II erupted, Lindbergh was one of the world's leading authorities on long-range flight. But his relationship with the U.S. military was anything but simple. Before the war, Lindbergh had been a leading voice of isolationism, serving as the public face of the America First Committee, opposing U.S. involvement in Europe. His stance and perceived admiration for German aviation made him a political pariah. After President Franklin D. Roosevelt compared him to a Confederate sympathizer in 1941, Lindbergh resigned his Army Air Corps Reserve Commission in protest. When Pearl Harbor was attacked later that year, Lindbergh tried to rejoin, but Roosevelt personally barred him from wearing a uniform again. So Lindbergh found another way to serve. He became a civilian consultant, offering his technical skills to major aircraft companies. Working with United Aircraft Corporation and its Chance-Vought division, he helped improve the F-4U Corsair fighter. He visited Ford's Willow Run plant, diagnosing production issues in B-24 Liberators, and flew dangerous high-altitude tests in P-47 Thunderbolts to study engine performance. He even helped develop dive-bombing tactics for the Navy's Corsairs. These contributions were invaluable, but Lindbergh wanted more. He wanted to see combat. By early 1944, United Aircraft had an interest in studying twin-engine fighter operations, and the only American plane in that class was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Lindbergh proposed that he travel to the Pacific as a technical representative, observing P-38s in action. The company agreed. Before departure, he prepared like a man on a personal mission. On April 3, 1944, he visited Brooks Brothers in New York to buy a naval officer's uniform, without insignia, and picked up a small New Testament from Brentano's bookstore, noting in his journal, "Since I can carry only one book, And a small one, that is my choice. A decade ago it wouldn't have been, but the more I learn, the less competition it has. He left San Diego on April 24th, officially bound for Marine aviation bases around Guadalcanal. The mission was authorized by the Navy Department, but kept secret from the White House. Neither Roosevelt nor Navy Secretary Frank Knox knew he was heading into a war zone. What began as a civilian observation trip quickly became something else entirely. Marine officers invited Lindbergh to accompany them on observation missions, which in practice meant combat sorties. On May 21, 1944, he flew his first mission, a strafing run near Rabaul with Marine Fighting Squadron 222. Though officially unarmed observation, Lindbergh flew with his guns loaded and engaged targets. He quickly proved himself more than a theorist. By analyzing takeoff power settings, weight distribution, and climb speeds, he showed Corsair pilots how to safely lift off with double the rated bomb load, reducing accident rates while increasing strike capacity. Word spread fast. America's most famous aviator was not only flying combat missions, but solving problems that had baffled pilots for months. By mid-June, Lindbergh's interest turned toward the P-38 Lightning and the 475th Fighter Group, known as Satan's Angels, reputed as the best P-38 unit in the Pacific. If he wanted to master the Lightning, that was where he needed to go. On June 15, 1944, Lindbergh hitched a flight to Finschhafen, New Guinea, announcing himself at 5th Air Force Headquarters. There he met with Colonel Marion Cooper, and days later dined with General Ennis Whitehead, discussing his plans to observe P-38 combat operations. The authorization remained informal, but in the Pacific's flexible command structure, results mattered more than paperwork. On June 20th, he received his checkout flight in a P-38 with the 35th Squadron, 8th Fighter Group, his first experience in the twin-boom fighter. 6 days later, he landed at Hollandia, walking into McDonald's recreation hut and that fateful checkers game. McDonald, then just 29 years old and already a 10-victory ace, commanded the 475th Fighter Group, composed of the 431st, 432nd, and 433rd Squadrons. Their P-38J Lightnings were the best in the theater, upgraded with new intercoolers and larger fuel capacity. Yet even these aircraft faced limits. Long-range missions often left little margin for combat or bad weather, and many planes had been lost running out of fuel. At first, McDonald dismissed the quiet civilian politely. But when Lindbergh mentioned that General Hutchinson, commander of the 3rd Air Task Force, had sent him, the colonel reconsidered. He invited Lindbergh to fly a mission the next morning. Word spread through the camp. Charles Lindbergh would fly with Satan's Angels. Reactions were mixed. Some pilots were eager to meet the legend. Others doubted that a 42-year-old civilian could handle modern air combat. One ace, Major Thomas McGuire, second only to Richard Bong in total kills, wanted to see what the old man could really do. At dawn on June 27, 1944, Lindbergh prepared for his first P-38 combat sortie. Despite rain delays, the formation finally launched at 10:30 a.m., heading for Jeffman Island and Sam 8 Airfield. Lindbergh flew as Blue 3 on McGuire's wing, with Merrill Smith in another aircraft. When they returned, the mission seemed routine, but the ground crews noticed something strange. Lindbergh's P-38 had burned far less fuel than the others. When the flight returned to Hollandia that afternoon, the difference was impossible to ignore. Mechanics refueling the aircraft noticed that Lindbergh's P-38 had consumed significantly less fuel than any other plane on the mission. Even though he had flown the same route and altitude, the difference wasn't minor. It was enough to extend the Lightning's range by hundreds of miles. Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald and Major McGuire were intrigued. Pilots had always accepted the P-38's limitations. It was powerful and deadly but notoriously thirsty. Yet Lindbergh seemed to have found a way to make it sip fuel instead of guzzle it. The next morning, they gathered around him to find out how. Lindbergh explained his reasoning in the patient tone of a test pilot who had spent years studying engines. Every plane, he said, had an ideal relationship between manifold pressure, propeller RPM, and fuel mixture, a sweet spot that allowed maximum efficiency without sacrificing speed or power. Most combat pilots were trained to operate conservatively, following the flight manual. The manual's recommendations, for example, 2,400 revolutions per minute and 30 inches of manifold pressure for cruise, were designed to protect the engine, not to achieve maximum range. Pilots assumed that if they deviated from those numbers, they risked engine failure. But Lindbergh had discovered, through years of long-distance flying, that those limits were overly cautious. By running higher manifold pressure and lower RPM, the engine could produce the same power with less fuel. It was counterintuitive, more pressure, less revolutions, but it worked. He suggested trying 1,600 revolutions per minute with 30 inches of manifold pressure, a setting far outside normal procedures. The result? The same airspeed, yet nearly 15 to 20% less fuel burn. Over a long mission, that difference could mean an extra 400 miles of range, enough to reach distant targets and still have reserves for combat. At first, the younger pilots were skeptical, but McDonald, McGuire, and others decided to test it. They followed Lindbergh's instructions precisely on the next mission. When they returned, the numbers confirmed it. Fuel consumption had dropped dramatically, without any sign of engine damage. The results spread through the unit like wildfire. Soon, Lindbergh became an unofficial instructor to the 475th Fighter Group. Every morning, he joined their briefings and flight preparations, sharing calculations and detailed notes on engine performance. He emphasized smooth control inputs, precise trim, and patience. "Fly the airplane, don't fight it," he'd say. He didn't just lecture. He flew combat missions with them, proving his theories in the most dangerous environment possible. Pilots began to trust his calm professionalism. Despite being a civilian and twice their age, he earned their respect through quiet competence. By early July, he had joined dozens of sorties, flying alongside the group's top aces, Tommy McGuire, Charles McDonald, and Jack Mahurin among them. Together, they struck targets across the Molucca Sea, Halmahera, and Ceram. Lindbergh meticulously recorded fuel data after each flight, confirming his numbers again and again. He showed that a fully loaded P-38, previously limited to around 475 miles of effective range, could now travel 800 to 900 miles with fuel to spare. That difference opened up entirely new tactical possibilities. For months, Allied commanders had faced a geographic dilemma. Japanese bases lay just beyond their fighter escort range. Bombers could reach them, but without protection they suffered devastating losses. Lindbergh's fuel technique changed that equation overnight. It wasn't just fuel economy he improved. Lindbergh also taught small but crucial refinements in aerodynamics and gunnery discipline. Many P-38 pilots used to aggressive dogfighting pushed their planes too hard, climbing and diving at full throttle, wasting fuel and stressing engines. Lindbergh demonstrated smoother flight profiles that maintained energy without strain. He advised pilots to limit unnecessary use of propeller pitch and keep RPM low in level flight, saving both fuel and engine wear. His suggestions extended the life of engines that had previously lasted only 50 to 60 hours before overhaul. Even the unit's ground crews benefited. Lindbergh walked them through engine tuning, fuel calibration, and propeller balancing, translating complex concepts into plain terms. He was more teacher than celebrity, often kneeling beside mechanics, hands covered in grease, explaining how tiny adjustments affected efficiency. By July 1944, Lindbergh's reputation within the 5th Air Force had transformed from curiosity to legend. The once controversial civilian was now a valuable contributor to combat operations. Word of his presence spread across the Pacific. On July 11th, he flew a mission to Kao Bay, strafing enemy barges and installations. The following day, he joined a long-range escort to Bouila, Sarum Island, nearly 600 miles round trip, and returned with ample fuel remaining. In his logbook, he noted with satisfaction that the calculations proved true. Pilots began to say half-jokingly, "Lindy's way gets you home." But Lindbergh wasn't just surviving, he was fighting. On July 22nd, he and McGuire encountered Japanese fighters over Amboina Island. When a Mitsubishi Ki-51 Sonya dive bomber appeared below them, Lindbergh dove and fired a short burst. The plane caught fire and crashed into the sea. A confirmed kill. It was an extraordinary moment. Charles Lindbergh, civilian consultant, had shot down an enemy aircraft in combat. Technically, this violated U.S. military policy. Civilians were prohibited from engaging in offensive action, but in the chaos of the Pacific, few raised the issue. For the men of the 475th, it simply proved that the legend could still fight. Lindbergh's partnership with the pilots deepened. McGuire, in particular, formed a strong friendship with him. Though McGuire was brash and competitive, he admired Lindbergh's calm precision. Together, they ran fuel trials and compared notes on tactics. One mission illustrated their rapport perfectly. On a long escort to Buru Island, Lindbergh's throttle linkage jammed. As he struggled to free it, McGuire moved in close, guiding him back safely. When they landed, McGuire teased him, "Guess even Lindy can have engine trouble." Lindbergh smiled and replied, "That's why we bring fuel for the unexpected." Lindbergh's presence did not go unnoticed by higher command. General George C. Kenney, head of the 5th Air Force, eventually received reports of the remarkable increase in range among P-38 squadrons. Curious and slightly skeptical, he invited Lindbergh to demonstrate. During a briefing at NADZAB, Lindbergh outlined his method using equations scribbled in pencil across a scrap of paper. Kenney listened, then asked bluntly, "You're sure it doesn't hurt the engines?" Lindbergh replied evenly, "Not if the pilot respects the limits. The manuals underestimate what the engines can handle." Kenney decided to authorize the procedure for wider use. Within weeks, Lindbergh's technique spread across multiple fighter groups, the 8th, 49th, and 475th, standardizing what would soon become known as Lindbergh settings. This was no small achievement. By changing how pilots managed their engines, Lindbergh effectively expanded the operational radius of the 5th Air Force by hundreds of miles, enabling attacks that had previously been considered impossible. By August 1944, Lindbergh had flown more than 50 combat missions, both with Marine and Army units. He had proven that his theories worked not just on paper but in battle. As General Kenney later wrote in his memoir, "Lindbergh gave us the key to long-range fighter operations in the Southwest Pacific." When he finally left New Guinea in late August, he left behind not only a new method of flying but also a generation of pilots who had witnessed the power of careful thinking over routine procedure. He returned to the United States quietly, still officially a civilian consultant. But within the 5th Air Force, his name became a byword for innovation and precision. After weeks in the Pacific, Charles Lindbergh had proven himself as more than a legendary name or a pioneering aviator from the 1920s. He was now a vital contributor to combat operations in New Guinea, a civilian teaching young aces to push the limits of the P-38 Lightning without compromising safety. Yet his arrival and success existed in a paradox. Prior to the war, Lindbergh had been one of the most controversial figures in America, widely criticized for his isolationist stance and perceived sympathy toward Germany. His leadership of the America First Committee, along with outspoken opposition to U.S. involvement in Europe, had made him a public enemy in the eyes of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In 1941, after Roosevelt compared him to Confederate sympathizer Clement Vallandigham, Lindbergh resigned his Army Air Corps Reserve commission. When Pearl Harbor drew the United States into World War II, Lindbergh attempted to rejoin active service. But Roosevelt personally blocked him from wearing a uniform. Officially, he could contribute only as a civilian. While some saw this as a political slight, it ultimately provided the freedom for Lindbergh to operate outside the conventional chain of command, allowing him to implement unconventional techniques that might have been resisted by traditional military hierarchy. Lindbergh's civilian status did not limit his impact. In fact, it amplified it. As a technical consultant for United Aircraft Corporation and related firms, he had accumulated extensive expertise in aircraft performance and fuel management. By the time he arrived in New Guinea, he had already tested fuel-saving techniques across multiple aircraft, including the F-4U Corsair and B-24 Liberator, and had logged hundreds of hours evaluating engine efficiency. Once in the Pacific, Lindbergh immediately applied his knowledge to the P-38 Lightning, observing the operations of the 475th Fighter Group, nicknamed Satan's Angels. Pilots initially received him with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Many were wary of a 42-year-old civilian, especially one whose fame predated the war and whose techniques challenged what they had been taught. Yet Lindbergh's calm confidence, combined with his willingness to fly actual combat missions, quickly earned trust. The first critical innovation Lindbergh introduced was cruise control for extended range. Traditional P-38 procedures recommended cruising at 2,200 to 2,400 revolutions per minute with the mixture set to auto-rich. While safe, this burned far more fuel than necessary, leaving missions constrained by range and operational radius. Lindbergh proposed something radical: lower RPM, 1,600, combined with higher manifold pressure, 30 inches, and a leaner fuel mixture, auto-lean. This combination, counterintuitive to pilots trained to avoid oversquare operation, dramatically reduced fuel consumption while maintaining effective cruise speed. P-38 configured this way could achieve roughly 2.6 miles per gallon, stretching a typical 570-mile combat radius to approximately 750 miles. With drop tanks, missions could extend to 9 hours, enabling flights previously considered impossible. When Lindbergh first presented these findings to the 475th in late June, the pilots were skeptical. Long-range flights of 7 hours already pushed physical endurance in the cramped, heat-trapping cockpit, and Lindbergh's recommended engine settings appeared to violate long-standing warnings against oversquare operation. Pilots whispered doubts. Some openly challenged the safety of the technique. Yet McDonnell, understanding the potential strategic value, chose to test Lindbergh's method. The results were undeniable. Engines remained within safe operating temperatures, oil pressure stayed steady, and cylinder head temperatures, the key indicator of detonation risk, actually ran cooler than at higher RPMs. Within days, other pilots cautiously adopted the settings, confirming that the technique was both effective and safe. By early July, Lindbergh's methods were becoming routine within the 475th. Pilots reported consistent fuel savings, enabling extended patrols, longer loiter times over targets, and safer returns even when forced to detour due to weather. Missions that had previously demanded precise, conservative flying now allowed for operational flexibility, enhancing the combat effectiveness of the P-38 group. This change was revolutionary. Previously, many high-value targets had been unreachable due to the limited range of existing fighters. Lindbergh's techniques suddenly allowed the U.S. 5th Air Force to strike enemy airfields, supply depots, and coastal installations previously considered out of reach. Fighter escorts for bombers could now accompany missions across greater distances, significantly reducing losses from unprotected raids. Lindbergh also continued to teach through example. He regularly flew alongside young aces, demonstrating that the civilian could operate a P-38 under combat conditions just as skillfully as any military officer. His logbooks and flight notes meticulously recorded fuel data and flight profiles, providing pilots with empirical evidence they could trust. Combat also tested Lindbergh directly. On July 28, 1944, he joined a bomber escort mission with the 433rd Squadron. Over El Puti Bay, the flight engaged two Japanese Mitsubishi Ki-51 Sonya reconnaissance and light bombers. One of the enemy aircraft, piloted by Captain Saburo Shimada, skillfully evaded multiple P-38 attacks in a prolonged 30-minute running engagement. Despite being outmatched in speed and firepower, Shimada's aircraft executed violent, tight turns, challenging the American pilot's marksmanship. Lindbergh responded decisively. In a head-on pass, he targeted the enemy's radial engine, firing a sustained burst. The propeller slowed, smoke poured from the engine, and Shimada's plane ultimately dove into the sea. This was Lindbergh's first and only aerial kill, officially unrecorded due to his civilian status. The pilots, however, agreed informally that he deserved the credit. The episode illustrated not only his skill but also the practical value of his participation. He wasn't just a teacher of theory, he was an active contributor to the unit's combat success. By August, Lindbergh had flown roughly 50 combat missions, including 25 in P-38s, and had survived several close calls, including one encounter with a Japanese Zero that nearly ended his life. Only timely intervention from McDonald saved him. After this near disaster, 5th Air Force leadership recognized that his continued presence in combat posed a serious risk. Lindbergh's techniques, however, had already proven their worth. His fuel-saving methods were formally adopted by the 475th and began spreading to other P-38 units throughout the Pacific. Pilots noticed an immediate difference. Extended range allowed them to engage in deeper fighter sweeps, longer air patrols, and safer combat returns. Units could now plan operations with new tactical flexibility, supporting MacArthur's advance across New Guinea and the Philippines. The impact extended beyond tactical advantages. Fuel savings created a margin of safety, reducing non-combat losses caused by forced returns or engine failures. Pilots who might previously have run out of fuel now returned with significant reserves, increasing survival rates. The operational radius increase, from approximately 570 to 750 miles, represented a 31% improvement, a figure with both immediate and long-term strategic consequences. Lindbergh's influence also extended to institutional culture. Traditionally, the U.S. military emphasized rigid adherence to manuals and protocol. Pilots were trained to follow standard cruise settings, and deviations were discouraged. Lindbergh demonstrated that evidence-based experimentation could safely improve operations. His success encouraged commanders to listen more closely to civilian technical experts, fostering better collaboration between pilots, engineers, and manufacturers. This lesson would resonate far beyond the P-38. By demonstrating that civilian knowledge could directly enhance combat effectiveness, Lindbergh helped shape a new paradigm in military aviation, one in which expertise, not rank alone, determined influence on operations. By the time he left the Pacific in mid-August 1944, Lindbergh had transformed fighter operations, not just through statistics or pilot training, but through the tangible application of his decades-long experience. Pilots of the 475th Fighter Group remembered him not only as a teacher but as a combat-tested comrade, whose knowledge had materially extended their range, their effectiveness, and their survival. By late 1944, the implications of Charles Lindbergh's work extended far beyond the 475th Fighter Group. His fuel-saving techniques for the P-38 Lightning were no longer experimental. They were transforming the operational landscape of the Pacific theater. Pilots flying long-range missions suddenly had an unprecedented level of endurance, allowing them to reach previously inaccessible enemy positions and conduct extended combat operations with confidence. The Pacific theater posed unique challenges. Unlike Europe, where dense airfield networks and relatively short distances allowed fighters to operate within conventional ranges. The vast expanses of the Pacific required aircraft to cover hundreds of miles over open ocean. Many Japanese bases were isolated on islands far from Allied airfields. Bombers could reach these targets, but without fighter escort, their missions were perilous. The P-38, with its twin engines and heavy armament, had the potential to fill this gap, but range limitations had historically constrained its effectiveness. Lindbergh's cruise control techniques addressed these constraints directly. By combining low RPM, higher manifold pressure, and lean mixture settings, pilots could fly for 9 hours or more, achieving ranges exceeding 950 miles on combat sorties. This allowed the Allied forces to provide fighter cover over missions previously considered beyond reach. B-25 bombers, once vulnerable to enemy interceptors on unescorted runs, could now operate with reliable fighter protection. The strategic consequences were immediate. During the liberation of the Philippines, for example, Lindbergh's methods enabled P-38s stationed in New Guinea and Morotai to escort bomber formations over vast distances, engaging enemy forces while retaining sufficient fuel to return safely. Pilots no longer faced the nerve-wracking choice between pushing fuel limits to engage targets or returning prematurely to base. This margin of safety not only increased operational effectiveness but also reduced non-combat losses, saving both aircraft and lives. Island-hopping campaigns benefited directly. The ability to strike enemy positions from greater distances allowed commanders to bypass heavily defended islands, establishing air superiority and securing key locations with fewer resources. Operations that might have taken months could now be executed in weeks, accelerating General Douglas MacArthur's advance across the Southwest Pacific. The strategic flexibility afforded by Lindbergh's techniques was thus as significant as any new weapon or aircraft. The adoption of these techniques, however, was not instantaneous or universally accepted. Some unit commanders resisted, citing concerns about engine reliability and adherence to flight manuals. Certain pilots, trained to trust their instincts and the prescribed procedures, viewed the new methods with suspicion. Maintenance officers worried about increased wear on engines operating outside traditional limits. Lindbergh addressed these concerns with a combination of empirical evidence and personal demonstration. He flew alongside the pilots on operational sorties, collecting data on fuel consumption, engine temperatures, and mechanical integrity. Over time, the results silenced the skeptics. No P-38 engines failed due to his cruise control methods, and fuel efficiency gains were consistently observed across multiple units. Gradually, his techniques spread throughout the 5th Air Force, becoming standard operating procedure by late 1944. Beyond tactical and operational benefits, Lindbergh's work highlighted the value of civilian expertise in wartime. Military hierarchies traditionally prioritized rank and combat experience, often undervaluing specialized knowledge acquired outside the armed forces. Lindbergh's success demonstrated that civilians could meaningfully contribute to combat effectiveness, provided they were trusted and given the opportunity to apply their knowledge in real-world conditions. His approach, teaching through personal example rather than abstract instruction, reinforced this lesson. Pilots learned not from lectures or charts alone but by observing the techniques in action. Lindbergh's presence in the cockpit validated his methods and earned him the respect of younger, highly skilled pilots, bridging the gap between civilian innovation and military practice. The P-38 itself played a crucial role in enabling Lindbergh's contributions. Its twin-engine design provided redundancy, allowing pilots to experiment with engine settings without catastrophic risk. If one engine experienced stress or damage, the other could safely return the aircraft to base. The Lightning's fuel system, with multiple tanks and transfer pumps, allowed pilots to manage consumption precisely, and its stability in level flight made it suitable for extended cruise operations, further complementing Lindbergh's methods. By contrast, single-engine fighters like the P-51 Mustang, which later became prominent in the European theater, lacked the same operational margin over water, making long-range experimentation far riskier. In this context, the P-38's characteristics, combined with Lindbergh's fuel management techniques, created a synergistic advantage that was strategically decisive in the Pacific. The results of Lindbergh's intervention were tangible. Units applying his methods reported extended combat radius. Missions previously limited to 570 miles now reached 750 to 950 miles. Increased mission duration. Flights could now last up to 9 hours without compromising safety. Greater operational flexibility. Pilots could engage targets longer, adjust to weather changes, and still return with fuel reserves. Reduced non-combat losses. Extended fuel reserves improved survival rates for damaged aircraft and allowed for safer navigation in challenging conditions. These operational improvements were particularly significant for the 475th Fighter Group. Flying exclusively P-38s, the group achieved 551 aerial victories, making it the top-scoring P-38 unit of the war. Pilots like Major Thomas McGuire, America's second-highest-scoring ace with 38 confirmed kills, benefited directly from the extended range, as did countless other squadron members. The broader lesson extended beyond technical specifications. Lindbergh's work underscored the importance of adaptability in warfare. The P-38 manuals were written based on conservative estimates and standard operating procedures, but the reality of Pacific combat demanded innovation. Lindbergh showed that by understanding the physics of flight, engine mechanics, and fuel consumption, limitations could be overcome and aircraft performance could be optimized for mission requirements rather than arbitrary restrictions. Moreover, the adoption of Lindbergh's methods demonstrated how data-driven approaches could complement traditional combat experience. Pilots learned to trust measured results over instinct alone, integrating analytical thinking into the art of aerial warfare. This fusion of knowledge and practice would have lasting implications, influencing post-war doctrine and the integration of civilian expertise into military aviation planning. By the end of 1944, Lindbergh's techniques were fully incorporated into P-38 operational manuals, and variations were adopted by multiple units throughout the Pacific theater. Pilots were trained on lean-of-peak mixture operation, optimized RPM and manifold pressure settings, and long-range cruise procedures. The knowledge Lindbergh imparted was no longer his alone. It became part of the institutional understanding of fighter operations in the Pacific. For the men of the 475th, Lindbergh was remembered not as a celebrity but as a mentor and comrade. He had arrived as an observer and left as a teacher, demonstrating that technical expertise, courage, and a willingness to prove methods personally could yield results far beyond what conventional doctrine allowed. Lindbergh's work also had an enduring psychological effect. Pilots learned that limits were often negotiable, that conventional wisdom could be challenged, and that careful observation and disciplined experimentation could create operational advantages that were previously inconceivable. His presence validated civilian contributions to military operations and encouraged greater collaboration between engineers, manufacturers, and combat pilots, a paradigm that would continue to influence military aviation long after World War II. In essence, Lindbergh's legacy in the Pacific was not measured solely in kills, sorties, or hours flown. It was measured in enhanced combat capability, improved survival, and the dissemination of knowledge that transformed the P-38 from a powerful fighter into a tool capable of extending American reach across the Pacific. By mid-August 1944, Charles Lindbergh's time in the Pacific had reached its conclusion. After flying roughly 50 combat missions, including 25 in the P-38 Lightning, and surviving numerous close calls, he was ordered back to the United States. His presence in combat, while invaluable for demonstrating his fuel-saving techniques, posed an increasing risk to both himself and the units he supported. Fifth Air Force leadership recognized that the combination of high-risk missions and civilian status could not continue indefinitely. The departure of Lindbergh was marked by respect and genuine affection from the pilots of the 475th Fighter Group. He had not only taught them methods to extend their operational range but had proven his skill in combat, sharing both danger and achievement equally with the young aces of Satan's Angels. The farewell was quiet, understated, and heartfelt, a reflection of the bond that had formed between a civilian expert and a military unit fighting under some of the harshest conditions of the Pacific theater. Once back in the United States, Lindbergh continued his technical contributions to the war effort. In October 1944, he participated in a joint Army-Navy conference at Naval Air Station Patuxent River, Maryland, evaluating fighter aircraft performance and sharing insights gleaned from his time in combat. He also flew and tested captured Japanese aircraft, providing invaluable information on enemy capabilities, and continued consulting for United Aircraft and other manufacturers, troubleshooting operational problems encountered by P-38 and other Allied aircraft in the field. While his role remained civilian, the impact of his work was systemic. By applying decades of expertise in fuel efficiency, engine management, and aircraft performance, Lindbergh had not only improved individual missions but transformed operational doctrine across multiple units in the Pacific. P-38s operating under his guidance could now reach farther, fight longer, and return safer, a combination that significantly enhanced Allied air superiority in the region. The technical specifications illustrate the magnitude of the improvement. The P-38J Lightning had a standard internal fuel capacity of approximately 410 gallons, supplemented by two 90-gallon main tanks, two 60-gallon reserve tanks, and two 55-gallon leading-edge tanks, with provisions for external drop tanks. Under conventional cruise settings of 2,200 revolutions per minute and auto-rich mixture, fuel consumption often limited the aircraft's combat radius to about 570 miles. By implementing Lindbergh's technique, 1,600 revolutions per minute, 30 inches manifold pressure, and auto-lean mixture, fuel consumption dropped to roughly 70 gallons per hour, extending the combat radius to 750 miles or more with drop tanks. In practical terms, this allowed fighters to reach targets previously considered out of range, conduct combat operations for 15 minutes or longer over the objective, and still return with a comfortable fuel reserve. The 31% increase in effective range was revolutionary, enabling strategic operations that directly influenced the course of the Pacific War. Lindbergh's contributions also had a profound psychological and institutional impact. Pilots learned that strict adherence to manuals and preconceptions could be limiting, and that innovation grounded in data and experience could yield tangible advantages. His work demonstrated the value of civilian expertise in combat operations, encouraging greater collaboration between pilots, engineers, and technical consultants. By proving his methods in real missions rather than from a desk, Lindbergh earned credibility that transcended rank, fame, or political controversy. This lesson resonated in the broader context of military aviation. Throughout the war, rapid technological development demanded adaptive thinking. Aircraft systems grew increasingly complex, requiring knowledge that often lay outside traditional military training. Lindbergh's success showed that when civilians with specialized skills were integrated into operational planning, both efficiency and effectiveness improved. His Pacific service became a model of technical intervention in combat, illustrating that knowledge, when applied with precision and courage, could achieve results equal to or greater than raw force alone. The story of Lindbergh in the Pacific also highlights the human dimension of combat innovation. At 42 years old, he faced physical challenges inherent in flying long-range missions against experienced enemy pilots, many decades younger. He endured cramped cockpits, long hours, and the constant stress of combat with the same discipline as any young lieutenant or captain. Yet he never requested special treatment. His credibility among the 475th Fighter Group stemmed from the fact that he participated fully in the risks of combat, demonstrating his techniques not as abstract theory but as actionable, repeatable practices. This personal demonstration was crucial. Had Lindbergh relied solely on lectures or written instructions, pilots might have dismissed his recommendations. By flying with them, participating in combat, and consistently showing the benefits of his methods, he ensured widespread adoption and lasting impact. He became a teacher in the most convincing way possible, through experience. The influence of Lindbergh's Pacific service extended beyond the war. His emphasis on fuel efficiency, engine management, and optimal performance envelopes informed post-war doctrine in both the U.S. Air Force and civilian aviation. Techniques he refined and tested in combat would later influence long-range fighter operations, strategic planning, and the integration of civilian technical consultants into military operations. Moreover, his legacy included the broader principle that innovation in warfare often comes from understanding systems deeply, challenging assumptions, and applying knowledge courageously. The P-38 Lightning, already a versatile and powerful aircraft, became even more effective through Lindbergh's intervention. Missions that had been considered marginal or impossible were now routine, providing both strategic reach and tactical flexibility. Lindbergh's life after the war continued in the shadow of these accomplishments. His wartime journals, published in 1970, offer a detailed account of his Pacific service, including the methods, missions, and lessons learned with the 475th Fighter Group. He remained committed to aviation and technical consultancy but gradually withdrew from the public eye. On August 26, 1974, Lindbergh died at his home in Kipahulu, Maui, at the age of 72 from lymphoma. True to his private nature, he had arranged for a modest, private burial. Only 15 people attended, and he was interred in a simple handmade coffin in a grave lined with lava rock at Palapalaho Church Cemetery. His epitaph, drawn from Psalm 139, reflected his lifelong affinity for flight. "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea." Though Lindbergh's Pacific service was brief, its impact endured. The P-38 Lightning, flown with his guidance, continued to dominate the Pacific Air War until the end of hostilities. Pilots who adopted his techniques flew farther, fought longer, and returned safer, proving that careful application of specialized knowledge could transform both technology and human capability. In the final analysis, Lindbergh's Pacific achievements represent a unique intersection of technical expertise, operational necessity, and personal courage. He demonstrated that published limits are often starting points, not ceilings. Experience and measurement can safely challenge conventional wisdom. Civilian specialists can provide critical operational advantages if given the opportunity. Personal demonstration of knowledge is more persuasive than abstract instruction. The story of Lindbergh's work with the 475th Fighter Group illustrates how knowledge applied with precision and courage can change the course of operations, much like overwhelming material evidence transformed perceptions of industrial might in other wartime contexts. Whereas German prisoners of war were impressed by American productivity, American pilots in 1944 were transformed by technical mastery in their cockpit. Ultimately, Lindbergh arrived as a celebrity observer and left as a comrade, a mentor, and a transformative figure in the Pacific Air War. His work extended the effective range of the P-38 Lightning, enhanced operational safety, and redefined the role of expertise in combat, leaving a legacy that endured long after the guns fell silent.